Adolf Hitler stands on the podium to great applause. His chaotic mind is racing as the crowd screams out, "Heil Hitler!" The crowd made up of not just Germans, but various nationalities that have fallen under his evil spell. The superpower of Germany is untouchable. There is no such thing as the Soviet Union anymore. The great of Great Britain is lying in the mud. Millions are being executed while millions more are enslaved in Hitler's labor camps. There's just one more thing to accomplish, and that's annihilating the USA to subdue what Hitler regards as a low-down dirty race of mongrels. He has won, and it's hell on earth for many. We'll get around to this standoff with the USA. But first we need to know how Hitler pulled it off, this unbelievable victory in Europe. Here we mixed reality with fiction, as you know. At the start of the Second World War in 1939, Hitler's army, the Wehrmacht, devastated Poland with its legion of panzer tanks and an incredibly efficient mobile infantry. The Poles were no match for the Germans. The attack was like lightning, which is what the word blitzkrieg was derived from. In September, German bombs were dropped on the town of Luck, not just destroying buildings, but even killing kids on their way to school. This sent a message of what was to come. The Polish pilot B.J. Salak noted, "The stench of burning and a brown veil of smoke filled the air all around our town." No one was spared. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, rained hellfire down on Poland. Trains were seen derailed from the tracks. Kids screamed at the sight of the dead. It was a terror no one could have expected. And so on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Amazingly, France was beaten in just 6 weeks, and in time something worrying occurred surprisingly. Most of the French accepted the new Vichy government, one sympathetic to Nazi ideology. Not many know that a large number of people in France endorsed Hitler's hatred toward the Jews. Bear this in mind as we go through this story today. But by that time, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg had already been beaten by the Germans. It was as if the German soldiers were on steroids, which isn't far from the truth in the view of their heavy use of powerful methamphetamine providing. And with Norway defeated, Hitler now had access to heavy water. Although not known at the time. This is a key ingredient in the creation of the nuclear bomb. This was bad news when France fell and the British were left scurrying for their lives on the escape from Dunkirk. It looked as though the Germans were totally invincible. These conquests so far meant tens of thousands of Germans killed and many more injured. France itself had lost 50,000 men in the invasion. Britain lost 11,000. But now Germany had a massive 1.5 million prisoners of war. It would have been much worse had the Brits not had their miracle at Dunkirk. Britain was at this point waiting for the Battle of Britain. It was a frightening thing to imagine. Not many people thought this small island nation could hold its own, but the fighting spirit still burned within Britain, as a wounded British soldier named Paul Ritchie said, when he was flown back to England from France. He couldn't imagine his country going the same way France had. In his own words, he said, "With my mind still filled with the blast and flame that had shattered France, I was seized without her disgust at the smug, contented new enjoyed behind the Seabury." Still, he worried about what was around the corner. On June 18, 1940, Winston Churchill spoke at the House of Commons in his impeccable oratory style. He said, "I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life." He was probably right. Churchill went on, "Hitler knows he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age." He said that upon the defeat of Germany, men will say that this was their finest hour, and take note, he said. Hitler would go after the USA. It was just a matter of time. According to this Tsar munching elitist, who admittedly was drunk and drugged up half the time, still he correctly envisioned the hell that Hitler would unleash. That's why Churchill was so against settling with Hitler. He was sure that at some point the furious Führer would have Britain in shackles and take over his empire. Hitler would not stop. Not until Nazi ideology pervaded the globe. The Battle of Britain commenced in the skies. British Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires fought it out with the German Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The so-called dogfights were crazy, and many young pilots who went up did not come back down alive. Anyway, here is how one Spitfire pilot described the day at work. "We were both flying in a tight circle, just a little more and I'll have him pressing the trigger. I waited expectantly for the 109 to explode. I've hit his wing. He was one of the lucky ones." Life expectancy for an RAF pilot during the war was a grim thing indeed. 60% of Operation Airmen died, were injured, or became prisoners of war. Around 51% of all RAF aircrews died. Bombs from German Junkers rained down on strategic locations in England, with sirens blaring on a regular basis during what the Brits called the Blitz. It went on for 8 months, but the British down below were typically amenable to hardships. One woman wrote in her diary, "I wonder what the pilots feel after all. Somebody loves them. Even if they're Nazis." At some point, Hitler made the mistake of withdrawing aircraft for Russia's planned invasion in May 1941. That really was a mistake. It turned out that Germans like a cogent strategic plan. The planes also often missed their targets, and British scientists were good at reading German signals and jamming the radars. The British public showed fortitude to a woman named Barbara Dixon wrote that she'd never even heard of Poland, but she'd do anything to repel the beast of Hitler, who she said was trying to blow us up or murder us in our beds. Historians say attacking Britain was one of the great blunders Germany made in the war, with the next one being the invasion of the Soviet Union. Had Hitler focused all his strength on Britain and not at one point said, "Okay, we'll come back for you later," the Brits might have settled with Germany. Many people in Britain wanted that. They didn't think Hitler was as crazy as he turned out to be. Hitler had many times expressed his liking for British culture, and he said, "Unlike those mongrels in America, Britain had a good Aryan culture prior to German propaganda is criticizing the British for their empire's atrocities and their plutocrats living like kings, while the working class lived in the slums." Hitler had some pretty good relations with certain British politicians. Britain's army was nothing compared to the German army, and no one really expected them to hold their own in the skies. Even the US ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, said Britain had no chance. Despite 23,000 civilians dying and around 33,000 injured with the German retreat, confidence was bolstered. It's not 1,000 RAF planes were shot down, with about 544 fighter command pilots losing their lives. Then, with bombers and coastal guard losses that added up to 1,542 planes lost and another 1,542 lives lost. The German Luftwaffe lost around 1,800 planes, and more than 2,500 pilots were killed across the pond. An American journalist wrote, "Adolf Hitler met his first defeat in 8 years, and what might go down in history as a battle as important as Waterloo or Gettysburg, Winston." Churchill uttered those now famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." This bolstered confidence in the US too, and elsewhere in the world. Germany wasn't invincible. It sent a strong message, and for Britain at the time, having the most powerful navy in the world, it knew no Germans would be walking down its streets anytime soon. But as we said, Hitler planned to come back for Britain just as soon as he'd taken care of other matters, namely the Soviet Union. The reason we spent some time on this matter is that had Britain been soundly beaten and backed down, the whole outcome of the war would have been different. With Britain out of the war, Germany could have focused less time on one very formidable foe in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa, would have also sent a strong message to the Soviet Union and the United States. Remember, the US didn't want to get involved in a bloody European war. US citizens didn't want their young men being shot to pieces far from its now incredibly industrious shores. But in our alternative universe, let's say Germany did succeed in having air superiority over Britain, Germany might have launched Operation Sea Lion, the planned land invasion of Britain. This was not Hitler's first choice. He had been hoping for the British to accept his offer to back down out of the war. This is what Hitler had said he needed to happen for that invasion to be successful. First, he said, the RF had to be beaten down in its morale and in fact that it can no longer display any appreciable aggressive force in opposition to the German crossing. Then he hoped the English Channel would be swept of mines, and if the British Navy was distracted with fighting in the North Sea and the Mediterranean, it would make crossing the Channel in England more achievable. Apparently even Hitler's inner circle wasn't keen on this idea. And if you read the writings of contemporary historians, most will tell you he would have failed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt suspected. Hitler was just trying to bluff Britain into pulling out of the war. He said, by God, even Napoleon failed to invade Britain. The place was a veritable fortress. The German now, maybe the Kriegsmarine, was no match for the British Navy. It ruled the waves and it had done so for years. But in our scenario, Britain lost in the air, the morale of the military and the public was very low. The British Navy, as Hitler wanted, was spread out. The German Navy fought remarkably better than expected, and before you could say shade and fruit, the powerful British elites were foreseeing losing their empire while watching panzer tanks make a mess of that beautiful British grass. The country soon surrendered just as France had. Now Britain was finished. Hitler could certainly win war with France and Britain subdued. And to our modern shame, many people in both countries were now buying into Hitler's Aryan rubbish. The Germans could now go full throttle at the Soviet Union. Okay, back to real life. Hitler had made a non-aggression pact with another tyrant, Joseph Stalin, but then he invaded Russia anyway. Never trust the word of the tyrant. The German army, full of confidence, was sure it would walk through Russia. They also said they were doing the right thing, as this 18-year-old German soldier named Henry and Mittelmann said, I accepted as natural that it was German duty for the good of humor, Hannity, to impose our way of life on lower races and nations who probably because of their limited intelligence, would not quite understand what we were on about. Hitler hated Jews, but he was no fan of Slavs either. His notion that most Germans were pure Aryans was utter ridiculous. Given centuries of the intermixing of people in Northern Europe, it was ridiculous. Full stop. But even so, he was prepared to annihilate slavish people. As for communists, once he'd won the war in Russia, they would either have to forfeit their ideology or die. The many millions of Jews in the Soviet Union would be hunted down and killed. As General Erich Heppner said, the war with Russia is a vital part of the German people's existence. It is the old fight of German against the Slavs, the defense of the European culture against the Muscovite, Asiatic flood, and the repulse of Jewish Bolshevism. So mark our words, the people of the Soviet Union would have been spared no quarter, or at least those that fit into Hitler described as the lower races. And while Joseph Stalin, by the time he died, had the blood of tens of millions of peoples on his paranoid hands. His zero tolerance to people not fighting was one reason why Germany couldn't defeat him. The Soviets killed around 300,000 of their own soldiers for refusing to fight, fighting badly, or going AWOL. People starved because of Stalin's focus on building weaponry above feeding his people. People even changed sides because they detested Stalin so much. But if he hadn't been so bloody despotic, Germany might well have won for the invasion Operation Barbarossa. Hitler deployed around 3.6 million troops, 2,700 aircraft and 3,600 tanks, which was record-breaking in terms of European warfare. Stalin had 2.9 million troops, 8,000 aircraft and 11,000 tanks. But the Germans were superior in terms of technology and general warfare. But let's think, if Germany had just defeated Britain in our fictional scenario, there would be a spring in the military step. They'd also be making use of that excellent British arms industry. For instance, in real life, Hitler had thousands of French prisoners of war slaving away in his munitions industry, plus around 650,000 French civilian laborers, not to mention the Vichy French fighting for Germany over in the USA. In real life again, many people didn't have much love for the Soviets. The famed American aviator, Charles Lindbergh, said at the time, "I would 100 times rather see my country ally herself with Britain or even Germany with all her faults than the cruelty of the godlessness and the barbarism of the Soviet Union." There was more support for Nazism in the US than you might think. Hence Philip Roth's alternative reality novel, The Plot Against America. The famed industrialist Henry Ford admired Nazi Germany, and he was for much of his life very much anti-Semitic, showcased in the anti-Semite books he published with titles such as The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem, back to our alternate reality with the British loss, and the USA hardly coming to the rescue. There is every chance that Germany could have won Russia, especially if its ally for the short term. Anyway, was Japan would also attack Russia. Just think, with Britain defeated, Japan wouldn't have to fight the country in Singapore, Hong Kong. And what were the Malaya and Burma? We also have to remember about the impact of all the countries of the British Empire that fought alongside Britain. Think about British India, and the massive impact it had on the war, or India alone, whose 2.5 million troops fought under British command. Think about Canada, which couldn't have fought on since it was a dominion of the British Empire, or even Australia, who, although they didn't join the war effort right away, still provided the Brits with manpower and resources. We understand this is overly simplistic, and we haven't even discussed any country's atomic bomb research, but let's just say after Britain fell, the invasion of Russia went as Hitler planned. It was over within the year this really could have happened, had things just been a bit different. What would the USA be thinking now after much of Europe and some of Asia had fallen? Adolf Hitler in Japan. As we said, Americans didn't want to fight a European war. William Catlin, the then head of Harvard, said as much one time, stating Hitler's going to win, let's be friends with him. Many people thought this way. Of course, they weren't fully aware of Hitler's plans for world domination and the sheer ugliness of what he was capable of. Still, the US had meddled in the war by freezing assets and preventing Japan getting the oil it needed to attempt to build its empire during the war, and Japan didn't much like this. American interference. The US wasn't totally out of the war, lending weapons to Britain and helping in other ways. All for a price, of course. But then companies such as GM, Ford and IBM also sold what was described as useful war materials to Germany. The US made hay, while bombs spilled down on Europe coming out of the war, much richer. It might have stayed that way. If Japan hadn't launched the famous attack, Japan had hoped that after attacking the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would refer to its isolationist policies in our alternate reality. The US had watched on as Germany's Operation Barbarossa was successful, and Britain and France were a spent force in this case, had the Pearl Harbor attack in the U.S. might well not have retaliated. But then had history been different, the U.S. might not have interfered one bit, and the attack on Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened in the first place, and that's how things are different in our alternate world. So right now Hitler's over the moon. The problem is he has enemies everywhere in his vanquished countries. This is why he's sending out death squads to hunt down the people he doesn't like. For this, he deploys mobile death squads, aka the Einsatzgruppen. They scoured German-occupied Europe looking for their victims, and that includes the Jewish people, communists, gypsies, anti-fascists and even intellectuals. Hitler didn't leave all the work to his death squad, though. He prepared a list in 1940 of what he perceived to be dangerous Brits kept in his black book. He is very well aware that he is much despised by a lot of people in occupied Britain. The French had a resistance, but it was small and only really significant close to the end of the war. Still, there would have been resistance in Britain to this black book. Contained 2,820 names, from Jews to journalists to anti-fascists. Despised to politicians, academics and novelists, all to be immediately arrested once Britain was successfully invaded. This book can give you some idea about what would have happened if Hitler had won the war. There are some names in the book that would surprise you, including the great writer Aldous Huxley. If Hitler had won in England, the writer of the book, Brave New World, might not have had the chance in 1949 to Small Black Square, George Orwell on his dystopian novel, 1984. We very much doubt he would have written to Orwell saying within the next generation, I believe that the world's leaders will discover that infant conditioning is more efficient as instruments of government than clubs in prisons by flogging them, and kicking them into obedience. He was right, as it turned out, in the long run. Anyway, Hitler was doing a lot of flogging and kicking in the UK, and perhaps Huxley, as well as other British intellectuals, who liked the idea of freedom, would have been sent to Nazi extermination camps. These Brits had known no idea they were on Hitler's hit list with the playwright Noel Coward writing after the war. If anyone had told me at the time that I was high up on the Nazi blacklist, I should have laughed and told them not to talk nonsense. For the most part, no one really understood what Hitler would do to secure his vision of a Nazi-led utopia in Britain as well as in the Soviet Union. Jews, gypsies, communists, certain kinds of intellectuals are sent to labor camps to work or die in the process. Young and fit people in Britain as well as Russia would be drafted to work for the Nazi war machine and its general industries. This machine has to expand after all. Hitler has the USA in his sights, the country now wondering if Churchill had been right and if they should have helped out earlier when Germany was more vulnerable. Meanwhile, Britain adopts a new government in line with the Nazi regime. That is an authoritarian, anti-Semitic and xenophobic government, led by Oswald Mosley, whose British Union of Fascists had just been resurrected after being disbanded in 1940. Not too many years earlier, Hitler had kept a keen eye on Mosley, impressed when he said things such as, "For the first two, I openly and publicly challenged the Jewish interests of this country." Commanding commerce, commanding the press, commanding the cinema, dominating the City of London killing industry with their sweatshops. And now with Hitler at the helm and his man Mosley in England, the German propaganda machine goes into hyperdrive. What's astounding is how quickly many people in Britain embrace what Mosley is saying. He promises an end to corrupt banking, telling them the upper classes have kept them in bondage for centuries. Soon, thugs like the old king and church mob squashing resistance to the British fascists, people are afraid to speak out against fascism. Progressives are hunted down, and something similar is happening in Russia. The Russian Fascist Party has never been that big. But now with Stalin and almost all of the Politburo exterminated or in labor camps, and with the Germans releasing many thousands of Soviet prisoners from gulags, a lot of people start to believe the Nazi propaganda. Millions had died under Stalin, millions more had been on the verge of starvation or been sent to gulags and generally lived in fear. That's why it doesn't take long for these deeply oppressed people to embrace another form of government, one that promises a better society as time goes on. While Germany focuses much of its efforts on industry and taking back the African colonies that had been taken away after the First World War, something strange is happening in the USA. The German propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels is incredibly effective. Even far away in the US, the mass exterminations have been kept away from the world's eyes for the most part, despite the rumors and in spite of the spying. The U.S. public doesn't know about those wicked massacres of innocent people. So now the Nazis spew out propaganda regarding how their new world order is rescuing people from out-of-control capitalist slavery and releasing them from the chains that they say the Jewish elite have placed on them. A worrying number of people are taking interest in the fascist movement in the US. Remember, this is a country where a massive part of the poor population has just gone through absolute hell during the Great Depression. Hitler blames all that on the Jews, and when leading fascism supporters in the U.S. talk, some of the American people listen, as they also do over the border where the Canadian Union of Fascists speaks at events. Then when Charles Lindbergh stands up and promotes his America First policy, pro-fascist isolationist in the crowd cheer. These crowds just keep growing and anti-Semitic sentiment grows with it. Even though the USA is already backward when it comes to civil rights compared to other advanced nations, racism becomes even more intense throughout the nation. The fascists in the USA leave Europe to its own devices. They say any form of intervention in European affairs will likely be disastrous, given now great power of Germany. People look up to Lindbergh when he says things like this. A few far-sighted Jewish people realize this and stand opposed to intervention, but the majority still do not. Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio and our government remember this guy is a national hero. When he speaks, many people are glued to his every word. The U.S. government has awarded this famed aviator the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Flying Cross. But now the Nazis have also given him metal, namely the Commander Cross of the Order of the German Eagle. The Nazis know that Lindbergh and Ford, two of the most powerful men in America, often discuss what they and the Nazis call the Jewish problem. Perhaps Hitler thinks Germany doesn't need to attack the US at its borders. Perhaps he can take control from within the borders with the help of an American fascist party working on his behalf. Hitler muses that it isn't as if this country of Mongols doesn't already have widespread white supremacy. America can quite easily be pushed over the edge. He assumes those he calls the mongrels will once again be enslaved and the Jewish will be executed. The racial segregation that already exists in the US will just be taken up a notch. Hitler wants that the US military pose no threat. But he has changed his mind as of late. Invading the US, he knows, is an almost impossible task, even though part of him believes the country's military is weak due to its racial diversity. He writes in his diary one day that he liked nothing more than to see New York in flames. Japan has already been granted part of the former Soviet Union, and the country is certainly up for an invasion of the US. But will it work? The months pass, the year takes over. And the power of the Nazis just grows and grows now, with so much European industry in its control. And an army like the world has never seen. The US is a David to the Goliath of Germany, and this is why the isolationists in the US win over so many of the people. War will mean mass death. It will mean certain defeat. Why not? Just as so many have said in the past, beyond good terms with Hitler, do some trade with him to become his enemy as a death sentence. And finance-wise, it makes no sense at all. Hitler contemplates on the costs of a long-distance invasion. But even with British ships now under his control, taking that many men across the sea is a Herculean task. Feeding those men, getting the fuel for the machines, moving all that equipment across the ocean just seems like a bridge too far. But if the Canadian fascists, who are now gaining popularity, like the British fascists, go for a war, a land invasion against the so-called decadent capitalists can happen over land from Canada. It will take time and the movement, many resources, not to mention it would also be very risky. Things aren't looking good for the US, damn. I think a lot of people in the UK had only been able to repel Germany. None of this would have happened. That little island losing to the Nazis had changed the entire outcome of the history of the world. Then one day Hitler is sitting at his desk and he receives a report that has taken months to compile. The report states that throughout Europe, an estimated 9.7 million Jews had been exterminated. It also states that 350,000 homosexuals have been killed, along with close to 840,000 Romani and Sindhi people. Things have moved much faster since Europe was defeated by Hitler. The report doesn't state how many disabled people have died in the camps, although Hitler is pleased when he reads that they're being used for various medical experiments. People of color, says the report, as well as intellectuals, are mostly being employed in slave labor activities, although many have also been exterminated. Meanwhile, scientists working in the USA are making headway with an atomic bomb project. Little do they know that if they could have collaborated with scientists in Britain, the project would almost be complete. Now Hitler has control over for Britain's project. Seeing that under Mosley Britain is nothing more than a German puppet state. It also helps that former King Edward VIII has been restored to the throne, a much more suitable monarch for the Nazis than George VI. But what about life in general? In this new Europe, Hitler believes that he can create a utopian society, but it's only possible when the people he thinks have caused the world's problems are all dead: man, woman and child. He hates religion, but in his new empire, he actually endorses religious tolerance. This is more out of fear of mass resistance than anything else. He also promotes selective polygamy, believing that if you mix the right genes, you will create the right products for his army, for his science projects, for his idea of societal harmony. At times this is oppressive for women, who are usually the ones selected strangely for a man with so much blood on his hands. Hitler detests cruelty to animals and even endorses but not enforces national vegetarianism. At the same time he abhors what he calls degenerative art, and he hates the artist just as much. Even if they do take the right box for his so-called master race. He bans pornography in Germany as well as prostitution. Some intellectual pursuits, certain kinds of writing and poetry, decadent music, excessive boozing and smoking. His puppet states are not asked to conform to these ideals, but in many cases the new fascists around Europe espouse and enforce the ideals of the Nazis. In some ways those who follow Hitler do see some benefits, even some businesses and industries improved since Hitler has taken a zero-tolerance stand against corruption. The totalitarian ways, he says, must be simple and without deceits. It is also horribly oppressive and leads to unhappiness that people try not to show. Just as one critic over in the U.S. says, the utopia that Hitler seeks can never be free from tyranny. Anyone who says they don't like this new paradise will be severely punished. The guy who writes that is soon beaten up by one of the now widespread pro-fascist mobs in the US. The year is now 1944. For some time British scientists have been working on an atomic bomb under the tube alloys project, something that has been kept secret from everyone except those who need to know in Canada. The project was actually started before the USA. His Manhattan Project. The Brits had forecast a bomb not being ready until 1947. But once the new German and Soviet scientists joined the project, and the Germans have more facilities with the newly built heavy bombers and a hell of a lot more money to make bombs. The project is completed in 1944, but the US Manhattan Project is also just about ready. Little did the world's public know that a nightmare situation is taking place in 1945. Both sides test their bombs, and so it is now known just how much destructiveness is in the hands of leaders, and more concerning, in the hands of a man who thinks very little of American mongrels. The strange thing is Hitler, despite the fact that he's gassed millions of people, does not embrace the use of super weapons. He's even held off on using chemical weapons, even though the Germans at the start of the war had a huge stockpile of deadly sarin gas. So it's not so surprising that he doesn't like the thought of using an atomic bomb. As for the US, it was well aware of what's coming back if it drops a bomb, and why would it when Hitler has not yet made it clear he will invade the US? As crazy as Hitler is, he doesn't want to die, he doesn't want his idea of utopia to be destroyed. Still, if something doesn't change in the US, he might have to do something. This Cold War stalemate creates a frenzy among the public, especially the American public, that according to the polls do not want to go to war with Hitler. It's during this next chaotic year that Lindbergh creates the American Fascist Party to be sympathetic with Nazi ethos, but with an assurance from Hitler that Germany will not interfere in American affairs. So how does Hitler finally win this war? It's when fascism wins in the USA, when fear, bitterness, anger and stupidity push people to polls to tick the box under American Fascist Party. Some of the poor just want change, and rightly so. But out of desperation, political distrust and lack of options, they unwittingly choose their own demise. Lindbergh has assured that no Americans will be harmed in relation to their race or creed, but already an ugliness has seeped into a once hopeful culture. Gangs roam the streets at night, throwing Molotov cocktails through house windows. The police don't do much to stop it. This will only get worse. Families of Jewish people, African Americans and other minorities for that matter, huddled together in living rooms and shed tears when they watch Lindbergh throw his fist into the air on his victory. It is a victory for Hitler just as much. America closes its doors to the world, but also inside the house. Something is rotten. No structure can remain standing when the foundations are warped into decay. Totalitarianism will eat itself and suppresses natural creativity, and with its societal progress it foments distrust and paranoia, and in that time leads to widespread violence and unhappiness. One day, goodness and morality, and love and compassion among races will win out, and that rotten house will fall down. But for now, the present is Hitler's utopia, hell on earth. Even for most of the ones who've asked for it, now you have to learn something that will amaze you, and why Hitler's nephew was his worst enemy. Or have a look at this.